Carolwood Barn. My name is Doug and I am a volunteer for the Carolwood Pacific Historical Society. I do not work for the Walt Disney Company. As you know, this is an unusual public day. We're usually open only on the third Sunday of each month, but we're very happy to welcome a lot of, shall we say, optimistic people here today. This structure was actually built in By the way, everything I'm going to tell you is absolutely true. This barn was built in 1950 in what was then Walt Disney's backyard in Holmby Hills, which is just a few miles from here. Walt Disney had a love of barns that went back to his childhood. When he was 5 years old, the family moved to a little farm outside of Marceline, Missouri, and Walt Disney always said for the rest of his life that the 6 years that he spent on that farm were the happiest years of his life. Now, we do not have any photographs of the Disney family from that time, but there was a photograph of the farm itself taken a few years earlier, and this is a detailed photograph of that photo, and it shows the barn that was on the back of the property. And if you look, it has a silhouette that's very similar to this barn. In fact, it's almost the same silhouette. Now, it was a few years later in 1946, many years later in 1946, when Walt Disney was a successful filmmaker in Hollywood, that he was working on a combined animated live-action film entitled So Dear to My Heart, pardon me. And in the live-action portions, there was a little family farm, Granny Kincaid's farm. Have any of you seen So Dear to My Heart? If you haven't, I highly recommend it. Well, when Walt Disney was describing that farm set to the art director, John V. Cowles, Jr., he described the barn in such detail that people felt that he wasn't just making up something, that he was actually describing something very specific. That in fact he was talking about the barn that he remembered from his happy childhood days. Up here we have some memorabilia from the movie So Dear to My Heart, and right here is a black and white photograph of the outdoor set for Granny Kincaid's farm. And if you look back, you'll see the barn, which looks exactly like this one. Well, that's because only a few years later, when Walt Disney decided to make a barn the centerpiece of his backyard railroad, he went to the same designs and said, recreate these in reduced scale for my workshop. Now, Walt Disney's love of trains went back to that same time period in his childhood. If you folks want to move down here, go ahead and move on down this way. There was a local railroad, the Santa Fe Railroad right-of-way, that went right through the Disney family property. And Walt Disney's Uncle Mike was an engineer on the Santa Fe, and young Walt knew that if he ran out into the fields and he waved at Uncle Mike would blow a special train whistle just for him. When Walt Disney was a teenager, he worked one memorable summer aboard the railroads. He was a news butch, or news butchers. These were young men in uniform who walked up and down the aisles of the trains, vending candy, gum, magazines, cigarettes, and other things to the passengers. So for Walt Disney, for the rest of his life, trains represented his first taste of independence, earning his own money for the first time, as well as the lure of travel to faraway exotic places like Kansas City. In 1948, Walt Disney was a guest of honor at the Great Chicago Rail Fair. America's railroads had come together to celebrate the centennial of American railroading.
Sorry.
Yes, I was going to say, if he wants to play with a train, he can press the red buttons.
That's all he wants to see.
America's railroads had come together to celebrate the centennial of American railroading in a great outdoor pageant called Wheels A-Rollin'. And in it, Walt Disney saw beautifully restored Victorian locomotives. He brought along one of his top animators with him on that memorable 1948 trip, Ward Kimball. Ward Kimball, of course, one of the 9 old men of Disney animation. Ward was also the first private citizen in the United States to own his own steam locomotive. In 1938, Ward Kimball purchased a steam locomotive that was being sold for scrap, and he spent the next 50 years restoring and operating it as the Grizzly Flats Railroad in his backyard in the San Gabriel Valley. On the far wall, we have some toy trains that belong to Ward Kimball, as well as other things that he used when he was working on the Grizzly Flats Railroad. Another one of Walt Disney's top animators, Ollie Johnston, also had live steam trains in his backyard. But Ollie's trains were 1/12 scale steam trains. This engine and cars that you see along this side are 1/12 scale steam trains, the same size as Ollie Johnston's, about the size of a modern dollhouse. You can see the sign to the right that says Flint Ridge. Well, all the things on that shelf and down on the table below belong to Ollie Johnston when he was working on his La Cañada Valley Railroad. Walt Disney liked to go over and visit, and it gave him some ideas about his own miniature railroad. Well, all these ideas were coming together about the time that Walt and Lily Disney were building a new house in Holmby Hills. This is a blueprint of the Holmby Hills property. As you can see, it was a long, narrow lot. It was built on the side of a hill with a level area up here on Carolwood Drive, dropping steeply down to a public access bridle trail in the canyon below. Up here at the top of the hill, they built the main house, as well as a garage and pool house, and they had a great big backyard where Lily Disney could have lawn parties. Halfway down the hill, Walt leveled out an area, and he named it Yen Sid Valley. Now I feel silly asking this crowd, where did he come up with the name Yen Sid? Disney backwards. And surely you have to know that there was a character in a Disney film named Yen Sid, and that was the sorcerer in the Sorcerer's Apprentice sequence of Fantasia. And now you also know that there was once a Yen Sid Valley as well. You can see the figure 8 that indicates the track for the Carolwood Pacific Railroad. Walt Disney, being the creative person he was, he started adding sidings and tunnels, and one night he came home very excited, and he said to his wife, "You know, Lily, we could put a trestle up the north end of the property, come all the way around the house, come down the hill on the other side, and give people a really wonderful ride." Well, Lily already thought it was a little odd that her husband, who was nearly 50 at the time, wanted to play with toy trains in the backyard. And besides that, she pointed out that up in the side yard, she was going to have beautiful formal flower beds that would be visible from the big picture window in the living room. She said, "I can't have a train puffing smoke and throwing cinders and ashes all over my flower beds." Walt went back to the studio, talked it over with the engineers, came back and said, "Lily, we've got the perfect solution. We'll put a tunnel through the side yard, and we'll bank the flower beds up over the top, and that way I can have my trains, and you can have your flowers." Well, Lily Disney knew once Walt's mind was set on something, he was going to have it. So she threw her hands in the air and said, "Fine, fine, build the tunnel." And Walt, for his part, had the studio lawyer Gunther Lessing draw up a legal contract right-of-way for Walt Disney's Carolwood Pacific Railroad to tunnel below Lily Disney's flower beds, and then had their two daughters, Sharon and Diane, sign as witnesses to the contract. In this way, Walt was able to keep legal peace in the family. You can see that tunnel on the blueprint, and if you notice, it has a very shallow S curve to it. Well, Walt thought it would be a lot more interesting if you went into the tunnel, you were momentarily plunged into darkness, and then as you came around that corner, you could see the light up ahead. Some people say, this was in 1950, that this was the first time Walt Disney not only designed an attraction for the public, but plussed it as well. Now, the contractor that actually built the Carolwood Pacific Railroad was going over these plans with Walt Disney one night, and he said, "You know, Mr. Disney, if we straighten out this tunnel in the side yard, I can save you a few $100s on the contract." Walt replied, "If I wanted to save a few $100s, I wouldn't build this whole thing in the first place. Just build it the way it's shown." And this layout that you see on this blueprint is the layout of the Carolwood Pacific Railroad as it operated from about 1950 to 1953. And down there in Yen Sid Valley in the top of the figure 8, you can see the location of this very barn. Now, we're very fortunate to have not only Walt's barn here in Griffith Park, but also some pieces of the actual Carolwood Pacific Railroad as well. Right here in the middle of the room is the crossing track that was in the middle of Yen Sid Valley. If you look closely at the side of the track, you can see vestiges of black paint clinging to the rail. Walt loved the idea of having the fantasy of his miniature railroad tied to the reality of a full-sized railroad. Actual train track is made out of iron, and when it's exposed to the air, it rapidly oxidizes and it turns black. A hobby railroad like this is made out of extruded aluminum. It's a bright, shiny silver color. So Walt Disney had every last inch of his track powder-coated with black paint, so that it would look just like the high iron of a full-sized railroad. This little switch was actually used in Walt Disney's backyard. This railroad switch was attached to the track, and it not only looks like a perfect 1/8 scale replica, it also operates like one as well. Now you notice I said 1/8 scale replica for Walt Disney's trains, and you may recall that I mentioned a 1/12 scale for Ollie Johnston's trains. 1/8 scale is half again larger than 1/12 scale, 1 inch to a foot as opposed to 1.5 inch to a foot. This is because Walt Disney wanted his toys to be bigger than everyone else's toys. This 1/8 scale switch does operate just like its full-size Victorian original. If you were to take the handle, lift it up and turn, this little arrow at the top would turn, the track would switch over, and the train would go off in that direction. There were 11 of these switches in Walt Disney's Backyard Railroad, and each one was also connected electronically to a board right here in the barn, so Walt could operate the entire railroad by remote control. This gondola car that you see in the middle is part of the rolling stock of the Carolwood Pacific Railroad. Once again, Walt wanted to keep the fantasy of his miniature railroad tied to the reality of the full size. This looks like it's made out of wood. In actuality, it's cast aluminum. But to make it look just like wood, lines were incised inside and outside. All of the vertical elements were cast in place. Even the little bolts, if you look closely, are cast in place. And if you notice, they don't line up. They're crooked. That's because on a full-size train, if they were in a straight line, drilling those holes would actually weaken the wood. It would cause the car to deteriorate more quickly. So even that much of a detail was recreated in this cast aluminum replica. Now, in 1950, you would have had two little seats added, so the two guests could sit here and tuck their feet inside. That's why the paint's worn off all along the bottom here. You'll also notice that there are painted decals and legends all the way around, and you see that it has the initial CP for Carolwood Pacific. The engine that Walt Disney chose to recreate was the Carolwood of the Central Pacific 173. The Central Pacific 173 was a particularly beautiful Victorian engine. It had been broken up in 1909, but there were good photographs and drawings left, and so Walt was able to have the Disney machine shop, under the direction of Roger Broggie, recreate it in a 1/8 scale replica. He also named his engine the Lily Belle, which was a pretty smart idea considering his wife's name was Lillian, and Lily Belle means beautiful lily. Now this engine was not one that belonged to Walt Disney, but it was built using the same plans that Walt developed for the Central Pacific 173 replica. Walt marketed those plans and castings and things to a little company he set up called Miniature Locomotive Company. And in that way he was able to recoup some of the investment he made into this rather expensive hobby. This particular engine is painted to represent the Disneyland Railroad engine number 1. This is because Walt Disney wanted the Lily Belle to be part of Disneyland, but he knew, based on experience at his home, that it did not have nearly the capacity that he would need in order to operate at Disneyland. And so, he had the Disney Studio Machine Shop create a 5/8 scale replica of the Central Pacific, and it was named Engine Number 1, the C.K. Holiday. He was the first president of the Santa Fe Railroad. So when you go to Disneyland, you will see an engine that is 5 times larger than this 1/8 scale replica, and 5/8 the size of the full-size Victorian original, with the exception of one important detail, and that is this cab. On this proportional model, you can see that the roof line of the cab falls below the sand dome and the steam dome, and well below the stack. But if you go to Disneyland, you'll see a cab that has a roof line that is above the steam dome, above the sand dome, and much higher to the stack. Furthermore, this roof has little curves and little peaks in it. Well, this is because Walt Disney, as brilliant and creative as he was unable to come up with 5/8 scale replica engineers and firemen, 5/8 scale people to operate his train. So they had to make the cabs a little bit larger in order to accommodate the human beings that have to operate. But when you go to Disneyland and see the engineers and firemen, if they're ever standing up in the cabs of engine 1 or 2, they're usually bent over to one side like this. That's because they are out of scale to the rest of the Disneyland Railroad rolling stock. Over in this corner is one of Walt Disney's own workbenches. All of the painted pieces of furniture that you see here in the barn were hand-built by Walt Disney. He had a lot of power tools and things here in the barn. The tools and equipment and things that you see here, these were all things that actually came from Walt Disney's own toolbox and which he used. Here's even a catalog for the Miniature Locomotive Company. Back here is the switcher board that Walt Disney used to operate the train by remote control. You'll see there are little lights that would tell him where the Lily Belle was, as well as little switches and little red and green lights that tell him which direction the train was going. Right up here is a photograph of Walt Disney operating the Carolwood Pacific from inside the barn at this very switcher board. This old antique telephone was actually wired up to the main house at the top of the hill. They could call down and let him know if he had guests at the front door, or he could call up to find out if lunch was ready. And back in the corner over there, the sink, the paper towel dispenser, the cup holder, all those things were used by Walt when he would come down here to putter around on the weekends. On Sunday mornings, he would stand right there at that sink. He would shave himself in the little mirror that you see against the wall, and he would get ready to greet his guests. Walt Disney loved to entertain guests with his miniature railroad. And in fact, his friends enjoyed it so much that they started inviting their friends. And then they started inviting their friends, and they started inviting their friends. It got to the point where Walt and Lily couldn't be sure who was going to be at the door when the doorbell rang on a Sunday morning, and if they had children with them, they were too tender-hearted to turn them away. Well, one Sunday afternoon in the summer of 1953, a guest was operating the Lily Belle engine. They took one of the corners a little too fast, the Lily Belle jumped the track and fell on its side, hot steam shot out, all the kids ran over to see what was going on, and, well, one of the little girls got burned on her leg. Well, Walt and Lily talked it over and decided it was probably time to put the Lily Belle away for a while. Besides, by the summer of 1953, Walt Disney was already thinking very seriously about a much larger place where he could entertain a lot more people at once, and that, of course, became Disneyland. The Lily Belle was put away, actually inside the tunnel, for several years, until it was put on display in the summer of 1955 inside Main Street Station at Disneyland. Some of you may recall having seen it in a diagonal corner display case that is still sealed up inside Main Street Station. There was also another engine that was put into a display case several years later. That was actually a replica that was created by the Oriental Land Company from some parts that Walt Disney had. The Lily Belle that was on display in Main Street Station went on a little bit of a world tour not too long ago, and it was shown, in fact, in two different presidential libraries, the Richard Nixon in Yorba Linda and the Ronald Reagan in the Simi Valley. Today you can see the Lily Belle and most of the rolling stock on display at the Walt Disney Family Museum in the Presidio in San Francisco. There are two cars on display at the Carolwood Room at the Wilderness Lodge at Walt Disney World in Florida, and we are very fortunate to be able to have this one on display here in the barn at Griffith Park. The track itself stayed in place until a few years before Walt Disney died, when he made arrangements to have it taken up and brought here to the Los Angeles Live Steamers in Griffith Park. The Live Steamers organized in 1956, just a year after Disneyland opened, and Walt Disney was actually an original member of the Live Steamers, along with Ward Kimball and Ollie Johnston. In fact, they named the loop that they created using Walt's track the Disney Loop, and it's still called that to this day. Now, because his track was made out of extruded aluminum, after many years of heavy use, it began to deteriorate, so they took that track up and replaced it with modern steel track. So this section of track that you see here in the barn is the only remaining section of the original Carolwood track, other than a few pieces that were salvaged when it was taken up here at Griffith Park. Lily Disney continued to live in the house in Holmby Hills until she passed away in 1997. According to the terms of her will, the property was sold and the money was divided among the heirs. The new owners wanted to build a much larger house, but arrangements were made to have this barn removed, carefully disassembled, and then reassembled here as a tribute to Walt Disney's train hobby. 80% of what you see here is Walt Disney's original Carolwood barn. The single biggest change is the roof. The regulations of Griffith Park require that all structures have a fireproof roof. So the shingles that you see out there are not the original ones that were here when Walt Disney had the property. As you know, the Live Steamers offer free train rides to the public every Sunday from 11 to 3. The Carolwood Pacific Historical Society, of which I am a member, opens Walt Disney's Carolwood Barn on the third Sunday of every month from 11 to 3. We are the only regularly operating Disney attraction in the world that is completely free to the public. We do, however, gratefully accept all donations, and we are always looking for new members for the Carolwood Pacific Historical Society. We are also in the middle of a capital campaign to raise money to build a permanent structure for the Combine car, and in which we will be able to display some more really cool stuff that we have that relates to the Disney theme park railroads. Well, thank you so much for your time and attention, and I do recommend, I understand today we have an unusual opportunity. This is not the regular part of my tour. That we have an unusual opportunity for you to step into the Combine car, to look around, to take flash photos of the things that are on display there, and to enjoy yourself.